tears are the cheapest thing in an affair. Sybil Williams chose a more expensive approach, draining the betrayer's bank account. When Elizabeth Taylor brazenly stole Richard Burton, the world awaited the first wife's downfall. Sybil responded with an unprecedented financial massacre. Stripping her ex-husband of $1 million, she left the couple to self-destruct in alcohol, taking the money to New York to build a unique high society empire. The final blow wasn't the divorce papers, but Sybil's use of her ex-husband's money to create a world of power that would forever keep him out of reach. This calculated pragmatism was not a sudden reaction to a Hollywood betrayal. It was a survival instinct forged decades earlier. Sybil Williams was born on August 27, 1929, in a Welsh coal mining village. She knew about hard grit long before she met Richard Burton. The air in Tylerstown was thick with coal dust and the reality of extreme poverty. People from the valleys did not survive by complaining or expecting the world to be fair. They survived by building thick calluses over their emotions and keeping their mouths shut. Sybil carried this Welsh iron inside her from the very beginning. She was an aspiring actress and a woman who understood the ruthless mechanics of the theater. More importantly, she understood the exceptionally fragile egos of leading men. When she married Richard Burton in 1949, she accepted a silent and brutal contract. He was a wild horse. He drank with a terrifying intensity. He slept with other women constantly. The rule she established was simple and unbreakable. He could stray into whatever beds he wanted, but he always had to come back to her. For over a decade, she maintained this incredibly difficult facade. She truly believed she had tamed the untamable beast of the British stage. Burton was a brilliant classical actor, but he was also a spectacular narcissist. He required the constant adulation of a crowd and the fleeting warmth of a new woman in every port to validate his own existence. Sybil stood beside him through his meteoric rise to fame, acting as his bedrock. She managed his chaotic life. She managed his volatile temper. She looked the other way when the undeniable smell of unfamiliar perfume clung to his expensive coats. She convinced herself that these numerous women meant absolutely nothing to him. They were just disposable bodies feeding her husband's endless, bottomless vanity. She held the ultimate prize in her mind. She was the official wife, the mother of his children. The other women were just rented entertainment that he used and discarded on the road. Then came Rome. The production of Cleopatra was notoriously plagued by budget overruns and clashing egos. It was within this chaotic environment that Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton met. Taylor, operating at the absolute peak of the Hollywood studio system, was accustomed to having her demands met. She had already navigated intense public scrutiny following her marriage to Eddie Fisher. When she and Burton crossed paths, the attraction was immediate. Both were formidable stars at the height of their fame, and their undeniable chemistry quickly created a public spectacle that threatened their respective marriages and the film's production. They drank heavily together. They fought viciously. They devoured each other on the film set while the cameras rolled, and after the director yelled, "Cut." The physical chemistry between them was undeniable and completely destructive to everyone in their blast radius. They paraded their mutual lust in front of the film crew, the exasperated director, and the relentless Italian paparazzi. They felt totally invincible. They were two of the highest paid and most famous actors on earth, and they genuinely believed the standard rules of basic human decency simply did not apply to them. They operated under the delusion that their fame excused their cruelty. Back in their rented Italian villa, Sybil waited in the quiet. The rumors started as hushed whispers from the film set and very quickly escalated to shouting headlines in the global tabloids. Burton and Taylor, the scandalous affair of the century. Sybil initially brushed the noise off with practiced ease. She had seen this exact scenario play out 12 times before with lesser actresses. She treated the breaking news with a shield of cold detachment. To her, Elizabeth Taylor was just another notch on her husband's already crowded belt. She was just a wealthier and slightly more famous version of the starlets he usually used up and threw away. Sybil stayed in the sprawling villa, managing the household staff, raising their children, and waiting for his inevitable fever to break. She fully expected him to return smelling of Italian wine, ready to offer a pathetic, drunken apology and slip back into his assigned role as her husband. She relied entirely on the old unwritten contract, the unbreakable rule that he always came home to the woman who built him. She severely underestimated the toxic, crushing gravity of Elizabeth Taylor and the bottomless weakness of Richard Burton. The Mediterranean Sea did not offer privacy. Instead, the open waters provided a clear vantage point for the paparazzi. Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor boarded a private yacht in Ischia. They were heavily intoxicated by Italian wine and their own staggering reflections. They lounged on the teak deck under the brutal summer sun. They did not hide. They flaunted their illicit connection. They kissed with a reckless intensity, completely ignoring the public setting. They believed they were entirely insulated by their immense fame. They believed the water surrounding them formed an impenetrable moat against the moral judgments of the ordinary world. They were tragically mistaken. A photographer with a long telephoto lens crouched on a nearby boat. He pressed the shutter. That single mechanical click severed Richard Burton from his past and ignited a global inferno. The photograph did not merely leak, it exploded. It bypassed the gossip columns and violently seized the front pages of every major newspaper across the globe. It was printed in London. It was printed in New York. It was printed in Tokyo. The image of the Welsh actor intertwining with the violet-eyed American goddess became inescapable. It was an era of strict moral codes, and the brazenness of their adultery shocked the conservative establishment to its core. The Vatican intervened. The Holy See issued a scathing public condemnation published in their official newspaper. They branded Elizabeth Taylor an erotic vagrant. They accused her of destroying families and mocking the sacred institution of marriage. The scandal transcended Hollywood gossip and became a matter of international moral outrage. Burton and Taylor reveled in the infamy. They thrived on the infamy, treating public outrage as validation. The Vatican condemnation did not shame them. It emboldened them. It validated their delusion that their love was a chaotic, unstoppable force of nature, too massive for ordinary society to contain. They paraded through Rome dripping in diamonds and smelling of gin. Taylor wore her conquest of Burton like a glittering trophy. She did not spare a single thought for the woman sitting in the rented villa just a few miles away. Taylor possessed a terrifying vanity. She viewed other women not as human beings with beating hearts, but as minor obstacles to be bulldozed over. She publicly humiliated Sybil Williams, flaunting the conquest to a global audience with a diamond-encrusted smile. She and Burton were a matched pair of destructive narcissists. They drank until they could not stand. They screamed at each other in the street. They confused their toxic alcohol-fueled dependency with a grand historical romance. They were already laying the foundation for their own pathetic, spectacular ruin. They thought they were gods, but they were merely slaves to their own bottomless appetites. Back at the villa, the siege began. The iron gates of Sybil's residence were assaulted by legions of paparazzi. They scaled the walls. They trampled the manicured gardens. They shoved their camera lenses through the wrought iron fences. They shouted vicious questions through the windows. They wanted a reaction. The entire world aimed its collective gaze at Sybil Williams. They demanded a performance. They expected the spurned wife to emerge with a tear-stained face. They wanted her to beg for her husband to return. They wanted to capture the exact moment her spirit broke so they could print it next to the photograph of the kissing lovers. They wanted to consume her humiliation for entertainment. Inside the darkened villa, Sybil did not weep. The air conditioning hummed a steady, cold rhythm against the stifling Italian heat outside. She sat perfectly still in an armchair, staring at the newspaper stacked on the mahogany table. The photograph showed her husband holding another woman. She did not feel heartbreak. Heartbreak is a soft, yielding emotion. Instead, the deep loyalty she had harbored for Richard Burton over a decade vanished instantly. The man she had managed, protected, and built from the ground up had humiliated her and exposed their children to global ridicule. He had broken the one fundamental rule of their brutal marriage. The illusion of his eventual return evaporated, replaced by a terrifying cold clarity. She ignored the media circus entirely. Instead, she began calculating her financial exit. Burton braced himself for the impending storm. He expected outrage. He waited for Sybil to call him screaming, to storm the film set, or for the Welsh temper he knew so well to erupt. The eruption never came. Instead, Sybil deployed total, absolute silence. She severed the communication lines. She instructed the household staff to turn away his messengers. She did not answer the telephone. She did not grant a single interview to the desperate journalists camping on her lawn. She vanished behind a wall of impenetrable ice. This vacuum of noise terrified Richard Burton. He was a man who required constant noise to drown out his own profound insecurities. He needed an audience. Sybil denied him his audience. Her silence was not a retreat. By refusing to engage, she completely stripped him of his power and dictated the terms of their separation. She reduced his grand illicit romance to a cheap, dirty spectacle that she simply refused to watch. He was no longer a rebellious king acting out. He was a misbehaving child locked out of the house. Burton began to unravel. The silence from the villa gnawed at his alcohol-soaked brain. He tried to force a confrontation. He sent intermediaries. Sybil turned them away. She communicated only through her solicitors. She shifted the battleground from the emotional realm where Burton thrived to the legal realm where she held all the leverage. She did not ask for a reconciliation. She asked for a brutal, uncompromising audit of their shared assets. She began calculating the exact financial cost of his betrayal. Elizabeth Taylor watched her new prize grow increasingly erratic. Burton drank heavier. The dark, brooding charm that had seduced Taylor began to curdle into pathetic drunken anxiety. The glittering romance on the yacht started to look like a desperate escape from a reckoning he could not avoid. Burton assumed he was in control of the scandal, entirely unaware that Sybil was already legally dismantling his empire. Sybil summoned the most ruthless divorce attorneys available. She retained a formidable legal team to execute a strict audit of their shared assets. She sat across from them in immaculate, tailored suits. She maintained strict, unwavering composure during these legal meetings. She presented ledgers. She presented property deeds. She meticulously outlined every single penny Richard Burton had earned during their marriage. She knew his financial architecture better than he did. Burton was a notoriously reckless spender. He threw money at vintage cars, bespoke suits, and endless rounds of drinks for massive entourages. Sybil had been the quiet accountant holding his chaotic empire together. Now she was dismantling it. She instructed her legal team to freeze accounts. She instructed them to target his future earnings. She was not seeking a comfortable alimony. She was seeking total financial subjugation. She wanted a settlement that would leave a lasting impact on his wealth. While Sybil systematically dismantled his finances, Burton and Taylor descended further into their own glittering squalor. The set of Cleopatra became an international laughingstock. The budget spiraled out of control, directly fueled by their unprofessional conduct. They showed up hours late. They frequently arrived violently hungover. Taylor required emergency hospitalizations. Burton required constant managing. They were a nightmare for the studio executives. They threw extravagant parties in Rome, attempting to drown out the reality of the situation. Taylor draped herself in Bulgari jewels, trying to blind the world to the ugliness of their actions. But the jewels only highlighted their desperation. They were two addicts feeding off each other. Their relationship was not based on mutual respect. It was based on a shared insatiable hunger for drama and alcohol. They needed the chaos to feel alive. When the camera stopped rolling, they turned on each other. The screaming matches that echo through their hotel suites were legendary. Burton would verbally abuse Taylor, mocking her weight and her intellect. Taylor would strike back with vicious precision, emasculating him in front of his peers. This was the grand romance the world was obsessing over. It was nothing more than two profoundly broken people dragging each other into a very expensive gutter. Observing the fallout from a distance, Sybil maintained clinical detachment. Recognizing that the dynamic of their marriage was irreparably broken, she shifted her focus entirely away from the public circus and toward securing her financial leverage. She focused strictly on the numbers. She knew that Burton, despite his current massive earning power, was fundamentally insecure about money. He had grown up in the same crushing poverty she had. His extravagant spending was a symptom of his fear of returning to the coal dust. Sybil knew exactly where to strike to inflict the maximum amount of pain. She would not attack his reputation. He was doing a perfectly fine job of destroying that himself. She would attack his bank accounts. The legal documents were drafted. They were heavy, thick stacks of paper outlining the systematic dismantling of a life. Sybil did not deliver them personally. She had a courier drop them off. The terms were uncompromising. The demand was clear: $1 million. A sum so astronomical in the early 1960s that it sent shockwaves through the legal community. It was not a request, it was an ultimatum. pay the ransom or face a public trial that would drag every dirty secret of his adultery through the international courts. Sybil knew Burton could not afford a drawn-out legal battle. The studio would not allow it. Taylor would not tolerate the prolonged bad press. He was trapped. The arrogant predator who thought he could take whatever he wanted was now staring at a piece of paper that commanded him to hand over his fortune to the woman he had discarded. When Burton received the documents, his bluster evaporated. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. The $1 million figure was not just a number. It was a statement of Sybil's absolute dominance. It proved that she had outplayed him. While he was engaged in a heavily publicized affair, she had quietly secured a massive portion of his wealth. He raged, throwing glasses against the wall and cursing her name to anyone who would listen. But his rage was impotent. He had absolutely no leverage. He contacted his own lawyers, frantically looking for a loophole. They told him the truth. Sybil held all the cards. She had the proof of his adultery. She had the public sympathy, though she never exploited it. And she had an ironclad grip on his finances. If he fought her, she would destroy him. He had to sign. The moment Richard Burton put his pen to the divorce settlement marked the official transfer of power. He was no longer the master of his own destiny. He was a man paying a colossal debt for his own staggering stupidity. The signature was sloppy, fueled by a heavy dose of scotch and profound resentment. Elizabeth Taylor stood by, watching her new prize sign away a massive portion of his wealth. The victory of stealing the husband suddenly felt remarkably hollow. The ex-wife had not crawled away to die. The ex-wife had just executed the most lucrative and ruthless divorce settlement in Hollywood history. Sybil Williams did not just take the money. She took his dignity. She dealt a massive financial blow to the great Richard Burton, tethering his future earnings to the extravagant lifestyle of his new wife. The hunters had officially become the hunted. Sybil Williams took the check. She did not look back. She boarded a plane. She left her fractured marriage behind in Europe. She was heading to New York. She was heading toward an empire. New York City in the mid-1960s was a concrete grid vibrating with raw ambition. It did not care about broken hearts. It only respected leverage. Sybil Williams stepped off the tarmac into the biting wind, carrying a briefcase that contained her emancipation. $1 million. It was a staggering sum of liquid capital. It was also a weapon. She did not use the money to retreat. She did not buy a quiet estate in the countryside to lick her wounds and fade into the role of the tragic former wife. She despised victims. Victims waited for apologies. Sybil demanded territory. She looked at the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan and saw a blank slate. Hollywood was a company town built on fragile illusions and studio contracts. New York was a mercenary city built on hard cash and brutal social hierarchies. It was the perfect ecosystem for a predator who had just learned how to hunt. She shed the skin of Mrs. Richard Burton with surgical precision. She cut ties with the sycophants who had hovered around her marriage. She secured a sprawling apartment in Manhattan. The silence of her new residence was not lonely. It was the silence of a war room. She spread her ledgers across the dining table. She had spent a decade managing the chaotic finances of a drunken Welsh actor. She knew how to balance books. She knew how to spot a bad investment. She knew the exact value of exclusivity. While she plotted her next move across the Atlantic Ocean, the architects of her previous misery were busy constructing their own glittering cage. Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor married in Montreal in March of 1964. The ceremony was not a celebration of love. It was a hostage exchange. They wore yellow. They smiled for the flashing bulbs of the press. They projected an image of total victorious defiance. The reality set in before the champagne went flat. Their highly publicized victory quickly showed its cracks. Burton looked at his new bride and felt the heavy, crushing weight of the brand they had created. They were no longer two actors. They were Liz and Dick. They were a multinational corporation fueled by public scandal and massive overhead costs. The $1 million check he had handed to Sybil was a phantom limb that constantly ached in his bank accounts. He was a man who measured his self-worth by his financial liquidity. Sybil had drained him. He was now heavily reliant on the Hollywood studio system to replenish his coffers. He was no longer a free artist. He was a high-priced workhorse indentured to the extravagant lifestyle of his new wife. Taylor's lifestyle required a constant, relentless stream of luxury goods. She required a constant, relentless stream of shiny objects to validate her existence. She demanded diamonds the size of paperweights. She demanded private jets. She demanded a lifestyle that burned through cash with terrifying speed. Burton was fundamentally a working-class boy from a coal mining town. He was deeply insecure about his wealth. He tried to buy her affection. He bought her the Krupp diamond. He bought her the Taylor Burton diamond. He threw millions of dollars at her feet trying to fill the void. It never worked. The jewels only provided a temporary high. When the high faded, the vicious reality of their incompatible temperaments returned. They bought a massive motor yacht named the Charisma, intending it to be a floating sanctuary away from the paparazzi. Instead, it became a mahogany prison. The isolation amplified their toxicity. Burton consumed vodka for breakfast, drinking until his brilliant mind blurred into an aggressive haze, while Taylor matched him drink for drink. Their arguments, fueled by deep-seated professional insecurities, echoed across the water. They shattered crystal against the bulkheads and resorted to physical violence. Burton mocked her weight and lack of formal education. Taylor viciously emasculated him, reminding him that she earned more and was billed above him. They were two addicts pushing each other closer to the abyss. They woke up the next morning bruised, hungover, and trapped. They apologized profusely. They bought each other more expensive gifts to cover up the blood in the broken glass. They repeated the cycle. It was a death spiral disguised as a grand historical romance. They were bleeding money just to maintain the illusion of their happiness. Burton was forced to accept terrible film roles purely for the paycheck. He prostituted his immense talent to fund their violent, chaotic existence. He stared into the mirrors of their luxury suites and saw a bloated, decaying sellout staring back. He loathed himself. He loathed the circus he had become. The profound self-hatred fueled his drinking. The drinking fueled the fighting. The fighting fueled the desperate need for more money. They were chained to a wheel they could not stop. Sybil stood in a dusty, abandoned warehouse space in New York. She wore a sharp suit and sensible shoes. She did not smell of gin. She smelled of fresh paint and ambition. She had surveyed the landscape of Manhattan nightlife and identified a massive, glaring void. The old elite clubs were stuffy and dying. The new discotecas were cheap and common. She saw an opportunity to create a hybrid. She wanted a place that combined the raw electric energy of rock and roll with the ruthless exclusivity of high society. She decided to build a fortress. She would call it Arthur. Refusing to simply hand her capital over to managers, she controlled every aspect of Arthur's creation, negotiating the lease, hiring the contractors, and directing the construction herself. She understood a fundamental psychological truth about the global elite. Rich people do not want to be included. Rich people desperately want to know that other people are being excluded. The value of a space is entirely determined by who is not allowed inside. Sybil designed Arthur to be the most impenetrable fortress in the Western Hemisphere. She focused entirely on the architecture of rejection. The velvet rope was not just a crowd control device, it was a weapon of social division. She curated the guest list with absolute dictatorial authority. She partnered with the right socialites. She brought in the right DJs. She designed an interior that was dark, sleek, and completely intoxicating. She transformed herself from a quiet Hollywood wife into a nightlife mastermind. She did not seek the spotlight. She sought the power that controlled the spotlight. She understood that standing on a balcony watching the most famous people in the world beg for a table was far more satisfying than sitting at the table yourself. The contrast between the two camps became staggeringly grim. Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor were constantly hunted by the press. They could not walk down a street in London or Paris without being mobbed. They were prisoners of their own overwhelming fame. They lived in a state of constant high alert. They hid behind bodyguards and tinted windows. Their every public move was scrutinized and mocked. They were a traveling circus, and they despised the audience. They were suffocating under the weight of the Liz and Dick brand. Sybil Williams created a world where she was the supreme authority. She was not hunted. She was the gatekeeper. When Arthur opened its doors in 1965, the impact was immediate and seismic. The line stretched around the city block. The desperation to get inside was palpable. Sybil stood near the entrance. She did not smile. She pointed a finger. You come in. You stay out. She possessed the power to make or break a social reputation with a single nod of her head. Politicians, royalty, rock stars, and fashion icons practically crawled over each other to gain her favor. Truman Capote courted her. The Kennedys sought her approval. Andy Warhol documented her space. She stood on the balcony of Arthur, looking down at the packed, pulsating dance floor. Sybil stood in the center of her crowded nightclub, feeling the bass vibrate through the floorboards. She looked at the beautiful, wealthy, powerful people throwing their money at her staff. She felt absolutely nothing for them. They were simply patrons. She recognized that true leverage in New York came from structural power and that financial independence was her strongest, most reliable security. She did not need Richard Burton. She did not need Hollywood. She had conquered New York. Burton felt the shift in power across the globe. He was an avid reader of the international press. He saw the articles about Arthur. He saw the photographs of his ex-wife standing alongside the most powerful figures in America. He saw the massive success of her venture. It gnawed at his deeply fragile ego. He had always assumed she would quietly disappear. He had assumed he was the only star in their dynamic. The realization that she was thriving without him, that she was in fact wielding more raw social power than he was, deeply unsettled him. He was making terrible movies and drinking himself to death on a yacht. She was ruling Manhattan. The $1 million he had paid her was no longer just a financial loss. It was the seed money for his own psychological torment. He had funded the creation of a rival empire. Taylor felt it too. She was a woman who demanded absolute supremacy. The idea that Burton's discarded first wife was suddenly the toast of New York society infuriated her. She was accustomed to being the center of the universe. Sybil was operating in a universe where Taylor had absolutely no jurisdiction. Taylor could buy a larger diamond, but she could not buy the kind of effortless, cool, and structural power that Sybil had cultivated. Taylor's power relied entirely on her physical beauty and her scandalous reputation. Both of those assets were rapidly depreciating. Sybil's power relied on capital leverage and social control. Those assets only compound over time. The fundamental difference between the two women was finally exposed. Taylor was a commodity. Sybil was a market maker. The environment inside Arthur was carefully calibrated to maintain this high altitude. It was a sensory deprivation chamber for the outside world and a sensory overload chamber for the chosen few inside. The music was loud, the lighting was dark, the drinks were ridiculously expensive. Sybil monitored the room like a hawk. She knew every patron, she knew every secret. She collected information the way she collected cover charges. Information was just another form of currency in New York. She knew which politicians were sleeping with which models. She knew which bankers were facing indictment. She held the secrets of the elite, and that made her untouchable. She was no longer just a nightclub owner. She was the silent confessor of the American aristocracy. Burton attempted to return to the stage. He needed to prove to himself that he was still a serious actor. He took on the role of Hamlet in New York. It was a massive, heavily publicized production. The pressure was immense. He was terrified of failing in front of the unforgiving Broadway critics. The drinking escalated. He required shots of vodka just to step onto the stage. He forgot his lines. He stumbled through the choreography. The performances were erratic. Some nights he was brilliant. Other nights he was a slurring, incoherent mess. He was fighting a desperate battle against his own deteriorating mind. Taylor sat in the front row, draped in furs, acting as his very public, highly distracting cheerleader. Her presence only highlighted the circus atmosphere surrounding the production. It was no longer about Shakespeare. It was about the freak show of Liz and Dick. While Burton sweat and slurred his way through Hamlet, just a few miles away, Sybil was holding court at Arthur. She did not attend his opening night. She did not send flowers. She operated entirely independent of his desperate need for validation. Her nightclub was packed every single night. She was turning away thousands of people a week. She was generating massive amounts of cash. She was investing that cash, diversifying her portfolio, ensuring that she would never rely on another human being for her survival ever again. She was building an impenetrable financial bunker. Burton's internal monologue became a dark, endless loop of regret and justification. He knew he had thrown away a profound talent for a shallow, glittering circus. He knew he had betrayed a woman who had offered him genuine stability for a woman who offered him endless chaos. The alcohol could not drown out the voice in his head that told him he was a fraud. He looked at the massive diamond on Taylor's finger, recognizing it as the exact cost of the chaos he had chosen. He had sold himself to the highest bidder, and he hated the buyer. The violence escalated aboard the yachts and in the hotel rooms. It was the physical manifestation of his own profound self-loathing. He was not hitting Taylor. He was trying to smash his own reflection. She adjusted the cuffs of her immaculate suit. She signaled to the bouncer at the door. The velvet rope unclipped. Another group of desperate elites filed into her fortress. The cash registers chimed. The empire expanded. Richard Burton was entirely out of the picture. There was, however, one absolute rule regarding entry. Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor were permanently banned. This was not a petty emotional ban. It was a calculated strategic execution. Sybil did not post a sign. She did not issue a press release. True power never explains itself. It simply manifests. The ban was communicated through the highly efficient, ruthless whisper network of the New York elite. The publicists knew, the agents knew, the handlers knew. If the most famous couple on the planet attempted to cross the threshold of Arthur, they would be publicly, unceremoniously turned away. The paparazzi permanently camped across the street would capture the exact moment the reigning king and queen of Hollywood were denied entry by the discarded first wife. It would be a catastrophic humiliation. It would shatter the myth of their omnipotence. Sybil had set a lethal trap using nothing but exclusivity. Burton and Taylor were effectively locked out of the cultural epicenter of the decade. They could buy islands. They could buy private jets. They could not buy their way into the only room that mattered. This invisible wall drove them into a state of profound paranoid fury. They were accustomed to universal submission. Directors altered schedules for them. Jewelers opened vaults in the middle of the night for them. Waiters bowed to them. Sybil did not bow. She locked the door and threw away the key. She reduced them to the status of undesirable commoners in the city that dictated global trends. Being permanently banned from Arthur severely damaged Burton's pride. He was a man who required constant external validation to quiet the screaming insecurities of his coal mining childhood. He needed to be the most important person in every room he entered. The knowledge that there was a room, a highly coveted legendary room operating at maximum capacity where his presence was explicitly forbidden, gnawed at his liver as aggressively as the vodka. I could not ignore it. The success of Arthur was ubiquitous. It was in the magazines he read. It was the primary topic of conversation among the socialites he entertained. His ex-wife had not simply moved on. She had built a fortress on higher ground and stationed snipers at the perimeter. He was completely outflanked. The psychological toll on Elizabeth Taylor was equally devastating. Her entire identity was predicated on her irresistible conquering gravity. She was the woman who took whatever she wanted. She had taken Burton. She had paraded him before the world. She expected Sybil to crawl into a corner and die of a broken heart. Instead, Sybil had taken Burton's money, multiplied it, and used it to construct a machine that actively rejected Taylor's existence. Taylor could conquer weak men, but she could not conquer structural institutional power. She could not bat her violet eyelashes at a velvet rope. The realization that she was entirely powerless against the cold, calculating machinery of Sybil's empire triggered a deep narcissistic injury. She retaliated the only way she knew how. She demanded more useless, shiny objects. The spending escalated to grotesque levels. The Taylor-Burton diamond, a 69-carat monstrosity, was purchased for over $1 million. It was a desperately heavy rock bought to distract the public from the rapid decay of the people holding it. It was a public relations bandage applied to a terminal wound. They paraded the diamond on television specials and at royal galas. They smiled with tightly drawn faces. The public applauded, but the applause was growing thin. The world was beginning to see through the glittering facade. They were no longer the passionate, star-crossed lovers of Rome. They were two aging, bloated addicts engaging in a very expensive public suicide. Their physical deterioration mirrored the rotting of their relationship. Burton's face grew puffy and red. The sharp, handsome features that had captivated stage audiences disappeared under layers of alcohol bloat and broken capillaries. His hands shook violently in the mornings. He required a stiff drink simply to function enough to reach the bathroom. He was a functioning alcoholic, rapidly losing the ability to function. His voice, the legendary resonant baritone that had commanded Shakespearean verses, grew gravelly and weak. His health and artistic reputation were in steep decline. Taylor's beauty also began to curdle. Her weight fluctuated wildly. She relied heavily on prescription pills to manage the physical pain of her various ailments and the psychological pain of her violent marriage. They traveled with an army of doctors who were essentially highly paid drug dealers, keeping the talent upright long enough to perform. They were entirely isolated within their own entourage. They surrounded themselves with sycophants who were paid handsomely to lie to them. The handlers told them they were brilliant. The agents told them they were beloved. No one dared to tell them they were becoming a punchline. They lived in a hermetically sealed bubble of delusion. They fought violently, destroying hotel suites, leaving behind a trail of smashed antiques and traumatized staff. They would scream at each other until their throats bled, then collapse into a drug-induced stupor, only to wake up and repeat the pathological cycle. They were victims of their own vanity, trapped in a cycle of mutually assured destruction. Sybil observed this tragic circus from the pinnacle of her New York empire. She read the tabloid reports of their public screaming matches. She saw the unflattering photographs of their bloated faces. She felt absolutely nothing. She had entirely excised Richard Burton from her emotional registry. He was no longer a man she had loved. He was merely the initial investor in her current supremacy. She stood in the center of Arthur, surrounded by the pulsing rhythm of the music and the sharp clinking of expensive crystal. She was surrounded by the most powerful people in America, and she owned the ground they stood on. She had converted her trauma into an appreciating asset. The financial disparity between the two camps began to quietly shift. Burton and Taylor generated massive amounts of gross income, but their overhead was astronomical. They supported dozens of hangers-on. They maintained multiple estates they rarely visited. They insured millions of dollars worth of jewelry. Their lifestyle became an unsustainable machine. They were forced to take degrading roles simply to fund their excesses. Sybil operated with lethal efficiency. She kept her overhead low. She maximized profit margins on every bottle of liquor sold in her club. She did not buy 69-carat diamonds. She bought real estate. She invested in quiet, diversified portfolios. She built an infrastructure of wealth that did not require her to perform for a camera or tolerate the abuse of a drunken spouse. She was securing generational wealth. She was establishing a financial footprint that would far outlast the fleeting fame of a Hollywood actor. She understood that cash is loud, but wealth is silent. She was accumulating silent, unstoppable wealth. The power dynamic had completely inverted. The woman who was supposed to be the tragic victim was now a ruthless tycoon. The couple who were supposed to be the triumphant conquerors were now pathetic addicts dancing for their supper. Sybil had not lifted a finger in physical retaliation. She had not given a single interview disparaging them. She had simply applied the cold, hard laws of economics and social leverage. She utilized the $1 million settlement not as a life raft, but as the strict foundation for her own financial empire. Burton knew he was losing. The alcohol could not completely obliterate his sharp intellect. In his rare moments of brutal sobriety, he recognized the totality of his defeat. He looked at his life. He was shackled to a woman who demanded constant, exhausting attention. He was alienated from the true artistic elite. He was a punchline in the very city where his ex-wife was currently the reigning monarch. He had traded his dignity for a chaotic, glittering nightmare. He tried to numb the realization. He poured another drink. He swallowed another pill. He yelled at an assistant. He bought another piece of jewelry. He engaged in every possible distraction to avoid confronting the terrifying reality that he had made a catastrophic, irreversible mistake. He attempted to write his way out of the guilt. He kept meticulous journals. He documented his drinking. He documented his fights with Taylor. He documented his self-loathing. The journals are a chilling testament to a brilliant mind slowly rotting in real time. They reveal a man who knew he was trapped, but lacked the fundamental moral courage to break the chains. He was a coward, hiding behind a booming voice and a famous face. He wrote about his profound failures. He wrote about the physical decay of his body, but he never wrote about Sybil. He could not bring himself to put her name on paper. The shame was too immense. The financial toll of the divorce remained a permanent drain on his resources. She was the living, breathing proof of his own profound stupidity. Elizabeth Taylor remained entirely oblivious to the deeper mechanics of her own downfall. She operated purely on surface-level vanity. She believed that as long as the photographers were snapping pictures, she was winning. She did not understand that the quality of the attention had drastically shifted. The world was no longer looking at her with awe. They were looking at her with morbid curiosity. They were watching a slow-motion car crash. They were waiting for the inevitable fatal impact. She continued to demand center stage entirely, unaware that the stage was slowly sinking into the ocean. She masked her aging with thicker makeup and larger hair. She masked her unhappiness with louder laughter and more aggressive demands. She was a hollow shell of a goddess propped up by a massive payroll. Sybil required no makeup to mask her reality. Her reality was structurally sound. She woke up every morning in a quiet, immaculate apartment. She reviewed her ledgers. She made calculated, strategic decisions. She managed her staff with strict but fair authority. She possessed absolute autonomy. She did not have to negotiate her existence with a volatile addict. She did not have to compromise her dignity for a headline. Sybil had completely reclaimed her autonomy, operating strictly on her own terms. She took the ultimate public humiliation and forged it into an impenetrable armor of liquid capital and unyielding pride. While Burton and Taylor decayed in European luxury suites, trapped in a medicated cycle of screaming matches and empty bottles, Sybil dictated Manhattan's social hierarchy from behind a velvet rope. Sybil Williams understood the rapid, unforgiving life cycle of Manhattan nightlife better than seasoned promoters. She did not fall in love with her own creation. She viewed Arthur with the same cold detachment she applied to her divorce settlement. It was a tool. It generated massive amounts of liquid cash. It established her as a supreme social authority. It annihilated the New York social standing of her former husband. The tool had executed its primary functions flawlessly. Now the cultural wind was beginning to shift. Sybil recognized the shifting cultural tide of the late 60s. Rather than clinging to a fading trend, She demonstrated her sharp business acumen by liquidating Arthur at the absolute zenith of its profitability. She reviewed her ledgers. Arthur was still immensely profitable. The velvet rope still commanded absolute terror and respect. The celebrities still begged for entry. This was the exact moment to strike. You do not sell a business when the lines disappear. You sell it when the lines are wrapping around the block. Sybil initiated the liquidation of Arthur. She negotiated the sale with ruthless efficiency. She did not express a single ounce of sentimentality for the dark walls or the flashing lights. She stripped the equity from the brand and transferred the cash directly into her meticulously managed investment portfolios. She closed the doors on her own terms. She walked away at the absolute zenith of her power. She left the New York nightlife scene as an undefeated champion. The exit was a masterclass in structural dominance. She did not fade away. She simply chose to stop playing the game because she had already won all the chips. Her wealth was now self-sustaining. She did not need to stand in the dark listening to loud music to generate capital. Her money was working for her in silence. She transitioned into the next phase of her life with seamless grace. She had proven her point to the world. She had proven her point to herself. She required a new environment. Enter Jordan Christopher. He was a musician and an actor. He was vibrant. He was talented. He was also 11 years younger than Sybil. This age dynamic was not a scandalous rebellion. It was a quiet assertion of total control. Sybil did not need a wealthy older man to provide for her. She was the provider. She was the anchor. Jordan did not rescue her from the ashes of her past. She selected him to join her in the empire she had already built. He brought warmth and artistic energy into her highly structured world. He did not carry the crushing, exhausting ego of a Richard Burton. He was a partner who respected the massive, formidable power of his wife. They married. The ceremony was discreet. It lacked the grotesque media circus of the Burton and Taylor spectacles. Sybil did not need validation from the flashbulbs of the paparazzi. She found genuine, quiet contentment. She raised her children. She supported her new husband's career. She managed her vast financial holdings. She lived a life of profound, elegant stability. She had successfully completely rewritten a narrative of the discarded woman. She was a matriarch. She was a tycoon. She was entirely free. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the 1970s arrived like a brutal hangover. The cinematic landscape had shifted, and the public was entirely exhausted by Burton and Taylor's endless drama. What remained was a grim, repetitive spectacle of two aging addicts. Audiences stopped buying tickets, turning their films, like Divorce His, Divorce Hers, and The Bluebird, into critical disasters and financial sinkholes. The blank checks from the major studios finally stopped. This financial drought triggered a massive panic within their ranks. Their overhead had not decreased. They still maintained a massive entourage. They still insured millions of dollars in jewels. They still required private jets and luxury yachts. They were hemorrhaging cash. Burton was forced to accept increasingly degrading roles simply to keep the lights on. He appeared in terrible television movies. He took supporting roles in derivative action films. He prostituted his legendary voice for cheap, fast money. The profound humiliation of his artistic decline accelerated his drinking. The vodka was no longer a crutch. It was a life support system. He consumed alcohol in staggering lethal quantities. His physical body began to systematically shut down. His spine deteriorated, causing him agonizing chronic pain. His liver became inflamed and enlarged. He developed bursitis. He suffered from severe insomnia. He would pace the decks of the Charisma in the middle of the night, shaking violently, a ghost haunting his own life. The handsome, virile actor who had conquered the London stage was dead. In his place stood a trembling, bloated, sick old man. Taylor fared no better. Her physical beauty, the primary currency of her entire existence, was fading under the weight of pills, alcohol, and constant stress. She suffered a litany of medical emergencies. She was hospitalized for back pain. She was hospitalized for pneumonia. She was hospitalized for exhaustion. The hospital rooms became an extension of their domestic war zone. The physical chemistry that had ignited the scandal in Rome had completely evaporated, replaced by deep mutual resentment and relentless psychological warfare. They were entirely trapped by their own mythology, unable to admit their grand romance was a catastrophic mistake. They isolated each other from old friends. They bred paranoia. They lived in a constant state of high alert, waiting for the next inevitable explosion. The explosion finally arrived in 1974. The marriage collapsed under the crushing weight of debt addiction and mutual hatred. The divorce was finalized in Switzerland. It was a bleak, miserable affair. There were no million-dollar payouts this time. The vast fortune they had generated had been largely squandered on maintaining their chaotic lifestyle. They divided the remaining assets. They divided the massive debts. They walked away from each other bruised, sick, and profoundly damaged. Burton stood outside the lawyer's office, a divorced man once again. But the context was entirely different. When he divorced Sybil, he was at the absolute peak of his earning power. He was the most famous actor on the planet. He was arrogant and full of fire. Now he was a physically broken, financially unstable alcoholic. He had traded a woman of immense silent strength for a woman of loud, destructive vanity. He had paid a terrible price for his own shallow desires. He was alone. Sybil read the news of the divorce in her Manhattan apartment. The newspaper lay on the mahogany table next to a vase of fresh flowers. She scanned the headlines detailing the sordid end of the century's most famous marriage. She did not smile. She did not feel a rush of vindication. Vindication implies that you still care about the outcome. Sybil had stopped caring a decade ago. She felt nothing but a mild clinical observation of cause and effect. She looked at the photograph of her ex-husband. He okayed terrible. He looked exactly like a man who had made a series of catastrophic life choices. She closed the newspaper. She stood up and walked to the window. She looked out over the skyline of New York. This was her city. She had conquered it. She had extracted her revenge, not by destroying Richard Burton, but by completely removing him from the equation of her own success. She had used his money to build a launch pad. She had used his betrayal as fuel. She had transformed herself from a victim into a monarch. She did not need to gloat over his ruin. His ruin was his own doing. Her victory was her own making. She turned away from the window and walked back into the warmth of her home. Her husband, Jordan, was waiting for her. Her children were thriving. Her bank accounts were secure. The air was clean. The silence was peaceful. She had successfully insulated herself from the destruction they had brought upon themselves. Burton's post-divorce life was a pathetic, desperate scramble for relevance. He tried to stop drinking. He failed. He tried to revive his film career. He failed. The industry had moved on. He was considered unreliable. He was considered a massive insurance risk. Directors did not want to deal with his slurring, his shaking, his sudden violent mood swings. He was a liability. He sat in hotel rooms around the world, isolated and sick, reading old reviews of his stage performances. He lived entirely in the past because his present was a nightmare and his future was bleak. He even attempted a disastrous reconciliation with Taylor. They remarried in 1975 in Africa. It was a pathetic publicity stunt. It was a desperate attempt to recapture the magic of their youth. The second marriage lasted less than a year. It was even more violent and chaotic than the first. The illusion was completely shattered. They could not stand the sight of each other. The second divorce was swift and merciful. It was the final nail in the coffin of their shared delusion. They were finally permanently separated, but they could never escape the brand they had built. They were tethered together in the public consciousness forever. When a journalist interviewed Burton, they always asked about Taylor. When a journalist interviewed Taylor, they always asked about Burton. They were prisoners of their own history. Sybil faced no such interrogation. When she moved through high society, she was respected for her own accomplishments. She was Sybil Christopher, the successful businesswoman, the theatrical producer, the founder of Arthur. Her connection to Richard Burton was a minor historical footnote. It was a trivia question. She had actively, systematically erased his shadow from her life. She forced the world to acknowledge her on her own terms. This was the ultimate execution of power. To take a man who believed he was the center of the universe and reduce him to an irrelevant detail in your own biography. She did not write a book complaining about the past. She wrote checks funding her future. She proved that the most terrifying revenge a woman can inflict on a cheating husband is not a screaming match in a driveway. It is total financial extraction, followed by absolute permanent indifference. Burton and Taylor were ultimately consumed by their own mythology, while Sybil took the capital and built an empire they couldn't access. The 1980s served as the final act for the chaotic Hollywood couple. Elizabeth Taylor's film career stalled, leading her to the Betty Ford Center to manage her chemical dependencies. Richard Burton's health rapidly failed. On August 5, 1984, he suffered a fatal cerebral hemorrhage in Geneva at age 58. Under the strict directive of his widow, Sally Hay, Taylor was barred from the funeral, locked out of the inner circle just as she had been locked out of Arthur decades prior. Sybil Christopher, meanwhile, never paused. In 1991, she moved to Sag Harbor, New York, and founded the highly successful Bay Street Theater. Returning to her theatrical roots as a supreme executive authority, she spent her later years collaborating with her second husband, Jordan Christopher, mentoring young artists and managing her substantial financial holdings. She passed away in 2013 at age 83. Burton and Taylor's romance remains a Hollywood cautionary tale of excess, while Sybil's trajectory stands as a masterclass in structural power, translating public humiliation into enduring independence and unyielding capital.